Next, in the Platonic corpus, we move to Menexenus. Menexenus is one of the unique dialogues of Plato in that it is a funeral oration. A much debated, mysterious piece. Scholars have been unsure of exactly what the point of this dialogue was. Was it Plato? Is it pseudepigrapha that is authored by someone else under the title of Plato? And I don't think anyone knows for sure. However, because it is cited traditionally, and as I understand, Aristotle cites it, which reinforces the possibility of it being legitimate, it is included in the Platonic corpus. And so the speech stands apart from the rest insofar as it's not a dialogue. It is a review of the history of Athens, especially from the days of the Great Marathon and so forth. So in it, Socrates declares that this chick, Aspasia, has this record, this tradition, this background of Athens, and he's going to kind of give a commentary on it. And so Aspasia, as I understand, was already dead, and there's a bit of a mystery as to the dating or anachronism involved in this dialogue. One scholar noted that while the funeral oration which Socrates delivers ascribed by him to Aspasia, the mistress of... Why is the funeral oration ascribed to the mistress of Pericles? It is no solution to cite the precedent of Aeschines' dialogue named after her, as some scholars have done. The fact that Aspasia had played a role as rhetorician in a work of Aeschines is not a sufficient reason why we should do so in one of Plato's. Why the glaring anachronism? We don't know, and so this is a curious element in Plato. We know that there's quite a few of those, some of which I've highlighted already in the process of these dialogues and our discussions. But we don't know with this one either. So really, we have what's called a panegyric, which if you are familiar with patristics, many of the church fathers would do elaborate panegyrics. There's one on St. Anthony. In the writings of Athanasius, there are quite a few. And this really is just a sort of almost a mythic legend tale of the eulogy, if you will. So when you go to a funeral and the various family members or the minister, religious leader, whoever recites the good points of the person, of course never bring up the bad points, that is essentially what a panegyric is, and they're very elaborate in the Greek Mediterranean tradition. So basically a lot of people think that this dialogue is rhetoric. It's a exercise in the skills of Socrates or Plato as a rhetorician. It's also satirical. So there's all these great lauding, congratulatory, grandiose, verbose statements about the motherland of Greece. And I think there's with a little bit of the jokiness, the sarcasm at the beginning of the dialogue that Socrates gives, I think we can probably assume that it is a satirical piece. So through satire, through humor, Socrates is actually mocking the prevalent assumptions of the greatness of Athens and Greece on the part of the populace, particularly as modeled or typified in these grandiose narratives. So there's discussion of the Persians and the rebellion or the defense of the Greeks against the Persians and Persian War, Darius, and so forth, which if we know biblical history, we can think of the book of Isaiah, where, the book of Daniel and Isaiah, where these civilization struggles are mentioned. Xerxes, Darius comes up in the book of Isaiah. So there's not, a whole lot to say beyond that. in regard to Menexenus. I think that, it's only a few pages, maybe 10 pages. So that pretty much sums up what it is. There's a lot of, exaggeration in it, as we said, because of its a lot of hyperbole, because it is most likely a satire piece. So moving on to the next dialogue, something a little more interesting, in my opinion, is Lesser Hippias. And Lesser Hippias is a fun debate with a sophist. Also questioned as to its authenticity. Yet, I think we do see a pretty consistent presentation of the Socratic approach, the elenctic method, question and answer. And in terms of the metaphysics and epistemology of Platonism, that's what we're looking at here. So, to boil this one down, it's a little bit longer than Menexenus, maybe 15 pages. Socrates is essentially utilizing more or less basic logic, and he's identifying the contradictions in the sophist by the name of Hippias. Hippias, ironically, begins his discussion with an extreme amount of pride. So his hubris is off the charts. He thinks he's the best at basically everything. He talks about how awesome everything he's made is, even his clothes. He's made all of his own clothes. They're the best. He's made his own jewelry. They're the best. It's all. Everything's the best. He's the best at philosophy. The guy thinks he's just the bee's knees. Right? He's the shit. Well, Socrates comes along and says, "Well, he sort of, plays along with this, right? He humors him and says, "Oh, I don't doubt that you are the greatest in all these things." And Hippias also claims to be the wisest, which, of course, perks Socrates' curiosity. So the interrogation begins, and he says basically that there's a discussion about intentionality and whether or not it's better to be intentionally deceptive or intentionally bad at something than unintentionally deceptive or bad at something. And so what Socrates does is essentially deconstruct the entire argument of Hippias throughout the dialogue. He says, "Do you not see, then, that the same man that you say is false and also true in these matters is a contradiction, essentially, and that the true man is not a whit better than the false man on your position? For indeed he is one and the same with him, and not the very opposite as you were just now imagining." So in other words, what happens is Hippias is sophism, and sophism is basically just the relativism. Sophists were the relativists of ancient Greece. And of course, sophistry is what dominates in our day. And sites like Jay's Analysis exist to combat the sophists. We consider them the great delusion of our era, and probably the great delusion in most eras, insofar as the entirety of their position is that there's nothing true. Everything is subjective. Everything is according to the whims of each individual. Nothing can be known for certain. Do what you like. It doesn't matter. And that's what Socrates is really calling out. And he does it by presenting an interesting version of the kind of presuppositional argument, which I've given many times, and I'm sure readers and listeners are familiar with, at least in some general sense. That's what Plato's doing here. That's what Socrates is doing. He says, on the one hand, Hippias, you want to make distinctions in the world. You want to say one thing is better than another. This man good, this man bad, this thing true, this thing false, etc. And he brings in math, too, which is interesting. Socrates does. He says, you talk about, these addition problems, these multiplication problems, 300 times 7, you expect there to be a correct answer, right? And so if there's a correct answer, then it's the true answer. And if it's the true answer, then that would seem to suggest basically that there is the true and there is the false, which is the very thing that Hippias' entire philosophy denies from the outset. There is no ultimate true or false. even though Hippias consistently wants there to be true and false, right? This is just the ultimate, total, complete, basic presuppositional argument in toto, summed up right here. And this is the way to never lose a debate. It's that simple. Because every other position will either have a starting point in terms of epistemology, knowledge, how we know things. They will either have the starting point that we can know things with certainty, or we cannot. So there's either objective truth or there is not. Okay, this is a case in which there actually is an either or dialectic, because they are mutually exclusive positions. They're not positions in which we can have a middle ground, right? And that's by the nature of the ideas under consideration itself, right? So sometimes it is the case that we can have beliefs or ideas or propositions that are in the realm of uncertainty, certainly. There are 20 trees in my backyard, right? Well, I'm not presently looking at my backyard. I've not counted the number of trees in my backyard. I don't know. So I might venture a guesstimate, and there might be a degree of certainty there, probability, so forth. But it's not absolutely certain, right, until I go and do investigation or so, etc. So in that regard, certainly there are beliefs and propositions that don't have the same level of certainty as a question such as, is there truth or is there not truth, right? Or say mathematical propositions, mathematical formulas, problems. The degree of truthfulness or certainty involved in those is, obviously a higher status than, something empirical, even something like the number of trees in my backyard, without empirical investigation, we just don't know. So that's really the crux of this, though, is to understand that what Plato's getting at with the sophists, with Hippias, is the internal contradiction of believing, on the one hand, that you can go throughout your life making distinctions, making qualifications, having some benchmark or standard of what's right and wrong, good, bad, etc., and then turning around and saying there is no good, bad, there is no right, wrong, everything is relative, and essentially it's a will to power type of situation, because there's a reason why Hippias is presented as extremely prideful. He's the most arrogant, ass that is encountered so far in the dialogues that we've gone through. And so his hubris is intentionally placed there as a manifestation of his sophism, right? The reason for the sophism is intimately connected with his self-exalting position of believing without really thinking it through or being consistent. Just a will to power, a dominative, I'm right because I'm me and I'm just badass, right? Well, perhaps you are right, perhaps you are not right? And perhaps you're badass, perhaps you're not. So, but you're being badass, if we grant that you are, does not lead to the conclusion that you are actually correct or good in your philosophy or consistent. Quite clearly the opposite is most likely the case. Now, I've had probably in my lifetime 200-300 debates with persons of the sophistical mindset, and sophists are completely arrogant assholes across the board. Again, because it's really just a sort of narcissistic position that quite common amongst your, say, mainline leftists. If we were to go interview the majority of people at, say, a Democratic Party rally, 99.9% of those people, I feel sure, would be sophists. They would be relativists. And there are many reasons for why relativism is so prevalent. I think the first philosophy talk I did in this series a few years ago was precisely on relativism and why it's so prevalent and widespread. and why it's kind of the default position that we start out with in life, because we're born kind of immature, self-centered. Babies, children are this way. And it's not until we grow up into maturity that we realize and learn, hopefully, that the world isn't actually revolving around us. There are objective principles and truths out there, and we can either submit to these facts of the world, or we can rebel against them. Submitting to them can, of course, provide one with a flourishing life, ultimately, where you learn to adapt to reality, to objectivity. Rebelling against them, remaining in a state of arrested development and immaturity, can lead to an early death. Right? So this is we think of Solomon's Proverbs. This is just basically the difference between the wise man and the fool. The fool thinks he's wise when he's not, as so many of the Proverbs elucidate. Next, we move on to Ion. Ion is a neat one. I was not familiar with Ion until I read it. It's one of the lesser known ones, also relatively brief, 10, 15 pages. And it's about music. And an interesting presentation is given by the person that Socrates is interrogating here, named Ion, who is a poet involved in the arts. And Socrates is going to make an interesting argument that the poet is not an artist. Interesting. The actor, also, he will say, is not an artist. Very curious insofar as we generally think of poets and actors as artists. But for Plato, for Platonism, there's a interesting distinction made. I'm not sure I completely buy this, but certainly interesting. And we might also title this the mystery of the Muse, insofar as Plato will engage in somewhat of an esoteric trek into the possibility of the gods possessing people in terms of what we know as the arts. For him, art is very specified in its focus, in its relations. Art, he says, does apply to the realm of knowledge, but he will go so far as to say that each separate art has assigned to it the deity, the power of knowing a particular occupation. And it is from this source that the inspiration comes. And so for the poet, he will categorize this as bacchanalian, right? So that we think of the rites of Bacchus. If we were to think of a modern bacchanalian figure, it would be, say, someone in the rock and roll field like Jim Morrison. Right? Jim Morrison blasts himself on drugs and gets up there and recites this sort of nonsensical, bizarre poetry, and he's just in a out-of-mind state, flopping around and screaming and singing and so forth. That would be a very bacchanalian presentation, Dionysian as well, as opposed to the Apollonian idea of reason. So for Socrates and Plato in this dialogue, we can certainly see a connection to the Bacchanalian / Dionysian in contrast to the Apollonian that Nietzsche made quite a big deal of. Apollonian, of course, referring to the sun, to reason, to logic, and the Bacchanalian Dionysian referring to madness, forces of nature, chaos, orgy, just go crazy, go buck wild. And the reason that Plato takes this approach is that, of course, in the Platonic metaphysic or epistemology or anthropology, the mind should control the passions. All right, so the passions, the emotions, these are baser drives and instincts. They can kind of run wild if they aren't put in check by reason, logic, and order. And as I said before, this is relevant for philosophy and modernity, insofar as that is pretty much what we see. People are generally speaking driven by emotion. They're not driven by rational critical thinking logic, being consistent, being coherent, living an ordered, meaningful life. They're more so driven by the passions, by emotion, and this really is self-destructive. So, think of the Dionysian Bacchanalian musicians, many of whom died quite young from overdoses and so forth, setting aside the question of the possibility of some of them being knocked off, which is certainly a possibility in many cases, as we've highlighted at my site, the work of Sean Helton on, say, Kurt Cobain. Regardless of the conspiracy assassination questions, it is quite obviously the case that persons who live dissolute lifestyles, addicted to heroin, etc., probably will end up dying young. So there's just the facts of life. You take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have. All right, that's our bad joke for the day. So art is gnosis, art is knowledge in Socrates, Plato's mind. It can't be the explosive irrationality of inspiration, enthusiasm, and emotion. It has to be sensible, coherent, meaningful, ordered, right? Now, Socrates thinks that the arts are good, and he does like the poets. He likes poetry, and in fact, there's even at times discussion of Plato's own works having a poetic aesthetic that's appealing, pleasing, that would, call into question the sort of contradictory statement at times that Plato was not a fan of music and revelry, and the more bacchanalian. But is, again, there's sort of a vagueness there. This is a debated question. Did he really or did he not? We don't know. But it's key, I think, in terms of a lot of the analyses I've done. If you think of my piece that I did, Hollywood Babylon, where I talked about the occult empire that we might ascribe to Hollywood. Think about the big Babylonian Gate in Hollywood, literally the big modeled after Babylon Gate. We can see how, for at least the ancient mind, for sure, the dramatic and musical is placed into the category of the mystic. It is the esoteric because it is, the musician, the actor is seen as a person who takes on an alternate persona, right? This is the origin of actor is of course the hypocrite, right? They're playing a role. And I think in extreme cases, it would seem to be that even there is a kind of dissociation. There is a kind of other persona that steps in and takes over, be it a benevolent spirit or a demonic spirit. This possibility is certainly there, I believe, in my worldview in metaphysic. And that's what Plato seems to back up here. He says about musicians, the muse and the inspiration of the muse. Poets are possessed. He says, just so the muse, she first makes men inspired, and then through these inspired ones, others share in the enthusiasm. A chain is formed for the epic poets. All the good ones have their excellent not from art, but are inspired and possessed. They utter all of these admirable poems. So it is also with the good lyric poets, as the worshipping corybantes are not in their senses when they dance, and so the lyric poets are not in their senses when they make up these lovely lyric poems. So when once they launch into harmony and rhythm, they are seized with the Bacchic transport and are possessed, as the Bacchantes. When possessed, they draw milk and honey from the rivers, but not when in their senses. So the spirit of the lyric poet works according to their own report, for the poets tell us they don't. The poets tell us, don't they, that the melodies they bring us are gathered from the rills that run with honey out of the glens and gardens of the Muses, and they bring them as the bees do honey, flying like the bees. And what they say is true, for a poet is light and winged. A poet is a light and winged thing, holy and never able to compose until he has become inspired, and is beside himself, and reason is no longer in him. So long as he has this possession, no man is able to make poetry or to chant in prophecy. Therefore, since their making is not by art, when they utter many things, and many fine things, about the deeds of men, just as you do about Homer, it is by lot divine. Therefore each is able to do well only that to which the Muse has impelled him. One to make dithyrambs, another to make panegyric, odes, choral songs, epic poems, iambs. In all the rest, each one of them is poor, for not by art do they utter these, but by power divine, since it were the art that they knew how to treat one subject finely, they would know how to deal with all the others too. Herein lies the reason why the deity has bereft them of their senses and uses them as ministers according to the soothsayers and godly seers. It is in order that we listen and may know that it is not they who utter these precious revelations with their mind, when their mind is not within them, but it is the God who himself speaks and through them becomes articulate to us. The most convincing evidence of this statement is offered by Tynnichus of Chalcis. He never composed a single poem worth recalling, save the song of praise, which everyone repeats, well nigh the finest of all lyric poems, and absolutely when he called it the invention of the Muses. Thus, they are nothing but interpreters of the gods, each one possessed by the divinity to whom he is in bondage. Dromenon. When you chant these, are you in your senses, or are you carried out of yourself? Does not your soul in an ecstasy conceive herself to be engaged in the actions you relate, whether they are in Ithaca, Troy, or wherever the story puts them? Disassociation. The music mysteries. And so, as from the lodestone a mighty chain hangs down of choric dancers, masters of the chorus, undermasters obliquely fastened to the rings which are suspended from the muse. One poet is suspended from one muse, another poet from another. We call it being possessed. They are held like marionette strings. There you go. Fascinating. So, what do we make of that? Well, what do you make of that? To me, it does suggest the possibility of spiritual inspiration from the etheric spiritual realm that comes to us, especially those of us who do artistic type things. I'm not so sure that I completely agree that reason is utterly lost. Perhaps in cases of, some complete possession or takeover, maybe. But this is more or less what the Stanislavski method of acting is, method acting, where the goal is more or less to, in an occult sense, channel the soul, personality, spirit of a departed person or some other person. So, this is the ancient tradition. And this is why acting and poetry has long been associated with esoteric practices, and the mysteries, the ancient mysteries. So, perhaps there is quite a bit of truth then to the idea of the occult in the background of Hollywood and acting and so forth. It would seem to be that is true. I did have an interesting quote that I wanted to read from Hollywood, my article, Hollywood Babylon, the inside story on the occult empire. And this is from Dudley Young, Origins of the Sacred Ecstasies of Love and War. The earliest gods were invoked by ritual act, dromenon, the thing done, such as sacrificial dance, commemorating the fact that our life begins and ends when they call upon us. Subsequently, the thing was said, legomenon, as well as done, and the dromenon was on its way to becoming drama. Once speech within the temple precincts have been endowed with the power of word magic. We have the invocation, properly so called. So there's also a good quote in the Golden Bough of Sir James Frazer that the original motive of most religious dramas or mysteries among the rude peoples was religious. The mysteries are performed not to teach the spectators the doctrines of their creeds or to entertain them, but for the purpose of bringing about those natural effects which they represent in mythical disguise. In other words, it is ritual. In a word, they are magical ceremonies, and their mode of operation is mimicry or sympathy. We shall probably not err in assuming that many myths, which we now know only as myths, once had their counterpart in magic. And that's what Plato was talking about. So, there we go. Fascinating discussion here with the possibility of inspiration from the spiritual realm. So, next we will talk about the Republic. It is time to move on into the Republic. So, listeners can look forward to that. That one's going to require, multiple pieces. I have read the Republic, so it's not a situation where listeners are having to wait on me to read the Republic. It is rather very complex, very difficult, so it takes a little bit of time and planning, and I'm also working on my book at the same time. So, as readers and listeners probably know, I've been fortunate enough to get a book deal. So we will be moving on into that. But for now, I think we're good stopping with the discussion of the Muse and the inspiration of spiritual beings, perhaps, when it comes to the arts or the non-arts, according to Socrates, of acting and poetry.